I'll fix this 1 second. Penn State University Press in next spring, called People of the Image, Jews and Art. And we have, in fact, been discussing Jews and art. This is Jews in art, right? Images of the people. We've talked about the earliest images, exemplification, and today, demonization, Jews as the root of all evil. And you can see a pretty demonic Jew there. Now, unfortunately, when you get to this material, there's such a sort of excess of material to show that I'm going to focus on some specific motifs. If you have questions about others, we might in the future continue that discussion. And you can, of course, leave questions for Ari in the chat. He would be very happy to talk, to bring them up. So just for those of you who weren't there last time, we talked about priests, prophets, and monarchs. And we asked really, what are Jews good for? That is, what is a depiction of a Jew helpful to the person who's depicting the Jew? In what way is it helpful? So one mode was, and I'll just review some of these because it's a preface to what we're doing today, the idea of holy ancestry. Here's Yishai, Jesse, and there's a tree growing from his body, sometimes from his loins, which has all the kings and the ancestors of who? Well, King David up here with his harp, and of course, Jesus and the Virgin Mary. Jews are good for being holy ancestors. And when you show them as holy ancestors, you don't demonize them, obviously. King David, right? Perfectly normal, if a little bit slack-jawed and having a religious experience. Jews are also good if you want to show patriarchs anticipating certain elements of Christian belief or faith. So Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob anticipating the Trinity, right? Father, Son, and Spirit. Or Abraham can in Christianity be used to anticipate the blind ritualists that the Jews are, right? They're willing to sacrifice anything, including their children. Or he can represent the man of faith who sort of predicts Christianity. The point being that Jews are good for something that goes beyond who they actually are. So when we talk about the prophets in Judaism, we talk about Martin Luther King-like people who are exhorting people to better behavior, or who are talking about the world as it could be, not predicting the future, but the world as it could be if people would just behave themselves. For Christians, Jewish prophets are predicting the future, and they're always predicting Jesus. And sometimes they predict by their very nature, by their very selves, they predict other characters from the New Testament cast list, so to speak, so that Elijah the prophet in the Hebrew Bible, here he is in a Greek icon with his raven, very cute, anticipates John the Baptist, right? In the book of John, they even ask him, are you Elijah? And he says, no, I am not. But he's mistaken for Elijah because Elijah sort of points the way in Christianity to John the Baptist. What else are Jews good for? Well, they are creatures of the law. And so showing Moses with the heavy tablets, or showing Moses as the lawgiver, really drives home the point that for Christians, Jews are about law and stricture and strictness, and Christians are about grace and love. Jews are also good for ritual. So they're fascinated Christian artists and in artistic context with Aaron the high priest. And remember, we talked about this very interesting phenomenon of Aaron being depicted as a bishop, but with his hat on sideways, right, to indicate that he's not a Christian bishop. And this sort of pagan slice of the moon, Diana's symbol, also to indicate his sort of non-Christian origins. And we talked about how Jews adopted the bishop-y dress of Aaron because that's how, when they sent a manuscript out, or they commissioned a manuscript from a non-Jewish illustrator, they said, well, we want Aaron. The non-Jewish illustrator said, Aaron who? He's the high priest. Oh, you mean like a bishop? Jew says, well, I suppose so, right? There was no other, the archaeological depictions of Aaron came much later in history for both Jews and non-Jews. Also, Christians like the idea that Jews, the ancient Jews were knights of a sort. So the books of Kings and the books of Samuel, with their depictions of the various characters, the stories of David and Saul, and David's sons, are important to Christians because they foreshadow not Christian ideas and ideals in terms of theology, but in terms of sociology, the knightly ideal, the ideal of the court. And then we have female judges and queens. So Deborah in Christian art, here she is again as a prophetess, or Miriam, the prophetess. And in this sense, they foreshadow or anticipate. You can see this sort of queen-like aspect, their nun-like aspect, in that they anticipate a character who appears in Christian art with some regularity called Ecclesia, the church. And here she is, elegantly coiffed, wearing a crown, holding the chalice, the cup for the Eucharistic ceremony, and the host floating on top, miraculously suspended on top of the cup, the bread, and she's holding a staff with a cross on it. So for Christians, these female figures anticipated, right, the idea of the church. So where are we left this week? We're left with the idea of Jews as representing something negative, not something ambiguously positive because it points to something else, right? But something that's more unambiguously negative. And that's something that unfortunately exists in tremendous volume throughout the historical record in the medieval period and the early modern period. And I'm going to touch on a few key themes. First of all, there were several libels that were laid at the feet of Jews in the late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. It's interesting that in late antiquity, Jews were regarded as, by Roman historians Herodotus and others, Tacitus even has some comments on this, Jews were regarded as lazy because they did not work 1 out of 7 days a week. So what Abraham Joshua Heschel, of blessed memory, made a virtue, the ancient Roman historians counted as a debit, as something negative. Jews are not working, Jews are lazy, Jews lay about. The other thing that ancient Hellenistic peoples, Greeks and Romans, knew about Jews was bits and snippets of the Hebrew Bible, particularly the book of Exodus, and the accounts of the plagues in the book of Exodus. And so what was also said about Jews was that they brought plagues wherever they went, and actually it's a much more it's a much more logical story that was told about the Jews as a slander in ancient Greece and Rome than the sort of highly imaginative story of the book of Exodus itself. The story that was told by Hellenistic pagans about Jews was that they had gone down to Egypt to escape a famine, but they brought disease as immigrants. It was anti-immigrant sentiment even in those times. As immigrants, they brought disease into Egypt, and terrible disease, and Pharaoh was so upset that he expelled them, right? So it's a sort of interesting take on the story of the Exodus and the plagues. The other thing that people were astounded by in antiquity about Jews is the fact that it seemed, at least, that in their temple in Jerusalem, nobody could know what the god was. So if you went to Mount Olympus, as you're going to do with Ari next year on this tour of Greece, right? You go to Mount Olympus, you'll see these magnificent temples, and you know that the roofs of the temples were open in many cases, and standing in the temple was a life-sized image of the god, right? So we have many survivals from the Parthenon. We have the friezes, we have small statuary, we have larger scale statuary, but what's missing is, since the Parthenon is the temple of the Parthenos, the Virgin, and for ancient Greeks, the Virgin was the goddess Athena. What is missing is the gigantic statue of the goddess Athena that stood in the temple, right? So everybody knew that if you had a temple, you had a gigantic statue, and the Jews apparently did not have such a thing. So that was a terrible thing how could people have such an unimaginative, small-minded religion as that? And so the other thing that ancient Greco-Roman Hellenists said about the Jews is that they worshiped the head of an ass in their Holy of Holies in the temple, but nobody knew because you couldn't see it, or they worshiped nothing. That was even better. The second temple, the Romans had a holiday talking about the Jews because they could say, guess what the Jews worship in the Holy of Holies in their temple, and it's nothing, right? Great, right? In the Middle Ages, the libels became more specific, and these are libels that basically have to do with the apparent Jewish penchant or tendency for murdering people and using their blood in ritual ways. So we have in the Middle Ages, very famously, the idea that Jews are involved in child murder, ritual murder of children. Sometimes the stories describe Jews as becoming impatient with their own children and killing them, such as the story of the Jewish man who put his child in the oven. This is clearly a reaction to the story of the binding of Isaac in the Hebrew Bible and the idea that Jews are so bloodthirsty that they will kill their own children. Um, and then, of course, the idea of doing it to others. So there are several famous stories of Jews who kidnap a Christian child, ritually circumcise the child, use his blood, it's a boy usually, use his blood for magical purposes, and then discard the corpse. And these accusations usually occurred when the body of an abandoned Christian child, either a child born illegitimately, a child who was causing trouble for his parents in one way or another, was found. Sometimes the corpses would be dumped in the Jewish areas, not ghettos. They're not ghettos until the Renaissance in Italy. But if you were to Prague, for instance, you know that these stories are the basis of the story of the golem as defender. Now, what's interesting to me is that in these initial early images, this is one from around 1150, the Jews and the Gentile accusers don't look particularly different. I mean, the Jewish man has, has this hat on, and he looks kind of cagey because he's looking at his child who he's just thrust into the oven. But everybody looks pretty much the same. By the time we get to the Weltchronik of Hartmann Schädel, to which we'll have occasion to return, the very first illustrated printed book in history from 1491, you can see that the Jews are caricatured in various ways. Jutting faces, profiles with big noses, prominent ears, sort of ugly caricatures. And the young boy who's being tortured and abused here is shown with fairly even and regular features. So it's not simply that we're being offered an historical record here. We're being offered a species of caricature. But what's interesting nonetheless here is that the Jews are depicted with money bags and keys. Um, they're all labeled Brunella, Israel, Tobias, Moises, Angelus, which is Malachi, Vital, which is Chaim, and then up here, who is that? Matthias and Gamliel. And here it says Simon, that's Simon of Trent. And the cult of Simon and Trent as a saint continued through modern times. So ritual murder, earlier depicted with very little difference between Jews and Christians. The blood libel, about 300 years later, depicted much more salaciously when it comes to Jewish physiognomies. And there are various accounts and images of host desecration. So the allegation that Jews, with the aid of a Christian maid or someone in the house of a priest, would steal the consecrated wafer from the Eucharistic service and use it for magical purposes, but often simply torture it because it represented the body of Christ. So in some cases, in some roughly contemporary examples, you have sort of caricatured rough-faced Jews here, and you have sweet-faced Jews at the same time. So it can't be said that Jews are always caricatured demonically, although they are sometimes, but not always. But you know them by their actions. Here, piercing the wafer. What often happens in these stories is that the the Christ child appears and chastises the Jews. The Jews are found out and then brought to their deaths. So here's an example of someone stealing the wafer, someone bringing it, a Christian stealing the wafer, bringing it to the Jews and being paid for it in good coin. The Jews in their synagogue up here, see the Ten Commandments, are stabbing the wafer. They finally throw it into the fire, and baby Jesus appears and chastises them. And so the Jews are executed and tortured. And finally, a pilgrimage church is built on the site of their former synagogue. For the most part, the Jews here are not demonized, although they're physiognomically, although their actions, of course, are quite demonic. Again, in the Weltkrieg, the accusation, the libel that Jews desecrated Christian crucifixes of various kinds. And here you have a Jew who's dressed actually in the short clothing of a typical young man, fashionable young man of his era. He looks a little bit knit, his eyebrows are knit somewhat, but he's not demonic looking. What's interesting is he's wearing fashionable clothes and shoes, and he has a sword. This is an era where Jews were sometimes prohibited from bearing arms, right? And he's piercing a crucifix, sort of re-crucifying Jesus. And of all these libels, what's interesting is that the first libel, of course, blood libel, comes about because bodies of Christian children are found. Sociological fact, we pin it on the Jews. The second one is iffy, right? You know, the idea that did Jews ever murder Christians in the Middle Ages? Probably they did once in a while, right? But did they do it for ritualized purposes on a regular basis? No, of course. That is a libel, right? People murder each other all the time across ethnic communities. The second accusation, that the blood is used for ritual purposes and Jews are circumcising Christian children, is simply just not true from what we can tell. Although it is true that Jews used blood, both human and animal, for magical purposes, because Jews, like Christians and like Muslims, were involved in the Middle Ages in various magical practices. Finally, the stealing of the host is entirely plausible. You can imagine Jews being curious about the host and perhaps buying consecrated hosts for use in magical purposes, or maybe not. Did the hosts manifest as the baby Jesus and accuse them of? No, didn't. But it's possible that Jews did that. So of those libels, I would say that the only one that's completely implausible that Jews never, would never have done is ritual circumcision for the purposes of extracting blood from little Christian boys. But did Jews murder Christians? Yes. Christians murdered Jews? Yes, of course, right? Did Jews steal the host and maybe try to perform magical operations on it? Perhaps. Were they involved in magical operations involving blood, human and animal? Yes, we have records of that from Jews themselves. But this one, the idea that Jews desecrated Christian sacra, Christian sacred objects and images, is entirely plausible, because you have to understand that in a situation where you are an oppressed minority, you sometimes go after the symbols of the majority. So when I was taught about this stuff, I was told that it never happened, that Jews never, would desecrate a crucifix because Jews are good, right? The fact is that Jews might also be angry. So these stories sometimes might have a grain of truth, at least these stories. So those are interesting to me. Why are these things important? Because in the period in which these libels were emerging, there was an increased emphasis on the idea that Jesus would manifest while the priest was saying the Mass, right? And so once Jews desecrated the host, which sometimes, as you see here on the right, flew up in the air, right? It didn't have to turn into baby Jesus. It could fly up in the air. You have these Jews wearing their Jewish badges. It's sort of, it's an attempt by Christians to tell stories, because now, after the year 1214, the Eucharist becomes something real. The body and blood of Christ is really, transformation really occurs. Before that period, you could think anything you wanted as a Christian. But after the Fourth Vatican Council of 1214, Catholic Christians were required to believe that the Eucharist had Jesus in it. And so the way you reinforce this story is by telling stories about Jews desecrating the Eucharist, because it proves that Jews also, even Jews, believed that Jesus was in the Eucharist. This is simply not the case, but Christians wanted to make that case. Okay, we want to talk about the Eucharist and matzah. There's the Eucharist. I'm going to skip over that. The accusations usually devolved on Jews burning the host or pricking it with a thorny object. And in the vast majority of these images, although Jews look a little bit angry, right? They have consternation on their faces or anger on their faces. They're not demonic. The first place that we begin to see Jews demonized is in early caricature. So we don't see this very much. This is a contemporary internet caricature of Jews by various white supremacist groups. That's not really what we see, but we see the beginnings of this in, for instance, a very famous document. There's a roll of the issues of the Exchequer, which is essentially English Crown Treasury matters. In 1233, Jews were, of course, expelled from England in 1290. So this is the run up to that. It's 60 years earlier, and you can see already that in this roll, it's a long scroll that is read vertically, right? At the top of the roll, there's a triangular piece with which it is affixed, and it depicts some of the creditors mentioned in the roll, Jews who owed money to the crown, and wealthy Jews, and they're labeled. So we have Moshe Moke here, and Avigail here, and we have Isaac here, Isaac of Norwich, with a money scale. Isaac is shown fairly sympathetically, and what is happening here is that we have a devil called Ko, and another one here, calling on a legion of devils. And here's another one here, and they are sort of poking at and somehow magically elongating the noses of these Jewish wealthy Jews. And then the head of the community is depicted as a triple-faced demon here. So caricature and demonization is something that we begin to see it in the 1200s, and it continues throughout the Middle Ages. A very strong and significant part of what we look at when we look at images of Jews in the pre-modern era is personification of Jews. So in caricature, we're talking about actual Jews who lived, in this case, in Norwich in the 1230s. We have their names. We have their faces. Now, except for the long noses, I should add, look how fashionable the French bob of this Jew has a very short beard, or the clean-shaven Isaac here, or here Avigail, who is wearing a fashionable cap with a hood, with a snood, right? These are people of wealth who are depicted as actual human beings. But the other thing that's done to and about Jews in art to demonize them is to personify Jews or all Jews or some characteristic part of the Jewish worldview in a discrete and archetypal form. And so this is the very famous sequence or set of synagogue and ecclesia. I showed you ecclesia on the left before. I'm showing you synagogue now. Let's take a few minutes because this is an oft repeated motif, and I'll show you a couple of instantiations of it. An oft repeated motif to think about what it actually shows. First of all, it shows both the synagogue, meaning the polity of the Jews, the Jewish religious community writ large, and the church, meaning the polity of the Christians, the Christian religious community writ large. We're not talking about buildings when we talk about synagogue and church, synagogue and ecclesia. We're talking about ideas, personifications, and it shows them, first of all, both as women, which is interesting. This, I think, is derived from the ideas in wisdom literature and late biblical literature. So in the Song of Songs, Israel, the people of Israel, is represented as a woman, as a lover, as a spouse, right? The Song of Songs is a book that can be read on many levels. It is an erotic poem. It is a wedding poem. It is a poem about God and Israel. It is a poem about God and the Jewish people. It's about humans and their love lives. It's about nature. It's about all those things. But one of the important and sort of enduring gifts of the Song of Songs to Jewish literature and religious literature in general is the personification of Israel, the people of Israel, um, as a woman, as the lover. This is continued in Proverbs, which depicts wisdom as a female figure. Wisdom has built her house, and wisdom is, wisdom is described throughout the book of Proverbs. And then finally, in the extra canonical wisdom literature, the Apocrypha and the Pseudepigrapha, often the Torah is represented as a female figure, et cetera, et cetera. And so Christians took this up and they understood the bride in the Song of Songs, the sponsa, the bride, to represent, the Virgin Mary, to represent the gospel, to represent the church as the spouse of whom? Of Christ, right? So ecclesia, synagogue, by the way, church, ecclesia, church, and Beit Knesset, synagogue, both mean the same thing. Both mean the same thing. It means a venue that gathers in. So ecclesia, right? You say somebody's eclectic. They gather together a lot of different kinds of knowledge and interests, right? So ecclesia in Greek, the ecclesios, right, is the gathering in of things, and the church gathers in her members. And the synagogue is the Beit Knesset, the place of assembly. So clearly, ecclesia, church, comes from Beit Knesset. And she's depicted as a woman who's beautifully accoutred and dressed and has her hair beautifully styled, whereas the synagogue is depicted in a parody of the high priest's garment. Her colors are yellow and green, the colors of jealousy. She is bearing the Ten Commandments, representing the Torah or the law, and they're so heavy that they're falling out of her hand and making her fall off to the side. She's unbalanced, she's undignified, and she carries a staff, which is a spear. That is, she fights against Christianity and Christian interpretations of the Bible as pointing to Jesus, but that spear is broken. It carries the yellow badge of jealousy. And most importantly, she is blindfolded. She is blindfolded because she represents the Jews who have every evidence of Jesus and his coming in their scripture, but refuse to see it, but blind themselves to it. The last interesting feature of this synagogue is that she's wearing a turban. The distinction between Jews and Muslims was not entirely clear for many people in the Middle Ages. And so if you could get all your enemies into one figure, why not? So Ecclesia and Synagogue, this is an intimate painting by the master of the Legend of St. Ursula, but also on Strasbourg Cathedral, also on Worms Cathedral. I'm focusing on Strasbourg because it's very beautiful. The depiction of Synagogue is sad and bittersweet, as we'll see in a second in a close-up. And Ecclesia is looking at her as if she's saying, why don't you come over to our side? Like with a sympathetic look, interestingly. This is all redone actually by a contemporary artist on the on the campus of Boston College. And I'll show you that when we deal with more modern images. But it's actually a very bittersweet image, and you can see her and the spear and the blindfold. Um, uh, it's uh, it's uh, it's found on many cathedrals throughout Europe, and it was so important that when the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris was ransacked by revolutionaries in the French Revolution, all the figures on the front of the facade were taken down. and given symbolic beheadings. So all the kings of Judah, who represented really the kings of France. So it was a right-hearted gesture, so to speak, on the part of the revolutionaries, right, to tear them down and cut off their heads, were destroyed. But also the image of synagoga and ecclesia was destroyed as well. And when Viollet-le-Duc, the great visionary Catholic architect who reconstructed the entire facade in the early 19th century, had the dilemma: do we reinstate this anti-Jewish image, ecclesia and synagogue, to the front of Notre Dame? And the answer was, of course, yes. So here's synagogue. Now, this sympathetic view is extended even to Jewish art. This is the Hammelburg Machzer, and it is a depiction of a poem, a liturgical poem for Shavuot, Iti Milvanon Kala Mirosh Amana. It's a poem for Shavuot that says, "Come from the Lebanon, my bride." And it's talking about the Torah. And so here we have a depiction of a Jewish man with a Jewish hat, and he is clasping hands as a symbol of marriage with a queen-like figure with an ermine robe, seated on a throne, wearing a crown and a blindfold. And this is often interpreted as an image of synagogue that's somehow redeemed. Apparently, in the Jewish Museum in Berlin, there's an exhibition of this. There's a scholar who maintains that. What I think is going on here is clearly this manuscript is made by a non-Jewish illuminator for Jews. And I think what the Jewish patron was getting at was this idea that is found both in rabbinic literature and in mystical literature. It comes out in the Zohar, but it's in Ashkenaz also, of the Torah as the maiden with no eyes, right? She's entirely inwardly focused, and she is acquired by Israel. I think there's a little bit of the idea that the bride in a Jewish ceremony is veiled. And so when these ideas were given to the illustrator had a book that had depictions of various things. We've been through this in some of my talks. So that, for instance, when a Jew wanted to depict Moses and his wife Zipporah fleeing Midian for Egypt, the non-Jewish illuminator opened up the book and showed the Jewish patron an image of the Holy Family fleeing Egypt. And the Jew said, "That's great, give me that, just take out the halos, get rid of this, change it, give me two children, et cetera, et cetera." So you would adopt and adapt what was in the model book. And of course, there were no models in the model book for a Jewish wedding. So what was there was ecclesia and synagogue. And so the Jewish patron adopted this from a model book, I believe. I don't think it's an attempt to redeem the image. I think it's just trying to think about how this might be configured. But 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. The protagonists are no longer around to interrogate. So we don't need to fight about it. The other category of symbolic Jews, of course, is what we might call, or what Joseph Leo Kerner calls, enemy painting. So the Jews represent the old enemy and the demonic enemy. So here, Jesus, a nice pasty-faced white boy with regular Aryan features, is brought before Caiaphas, the high priest, by his henchmen. They are darker than Jesus. There are 4 Jews depicted. The high priest here, his number 1 henchman, and then 1 henchman here and 1 henchman here. They have animalistic profiles, right? And they are definitely, we are now definitely again in England, on the road to anti-Jewish demonic caricature, a further development. The association of Jews and demons is found quite often, so that in depictions of hell, here's Lucifer, here are Jews being boiled in the cauldrons of hell. They're wearing these kind of witchy hats, which are further extension of this idea of the Judenhut, which is a strange hat that Jews may or may not have worn in this period that we've discussed before, but we can discuss again at some point. But what's interesting here is that it's not only Jews that are being boiled, but people who engage in homosexual relations and Christian heretics and others. So Jews are one group among many, and they themselves, as you can see, are not depicted in any particularly demonic way. They're actually quite sympathetically depicted, while the demons, by contrast, are hideous and, need I say it, demonic. Um, which brings us to the Renaissance. The Renaissance had its own way of troping Jewish difference that was less demonic, but it did make Jews into people who were not Christians in a very obvious way. This is Mantegna's painting of the 1470s of the circumcision of Christ. Very important event in the Christian calendar. In fact, it's celebrated as a holiday it's so important that it became New Year's Day. So January 1st on the Catholic calendar is the Feast of the Circumcision. It occurs 8 days after Christmas, so unsurprisingly, it's the day of Jesus's bris. And it was a subject in art because it represented Jesus subjecting himself or being subjected by his parents to torture at the hands of the Jews at the beginning of his life, which would find its parallel at the end of his life. Now, people are not caricatured here. The way we show that the Jews are old and bad and over with are by simply showing us in this depiction of the temple, which looks like a church with a flat against the wall side altar, the sacrifice of Isaac, Jews as barbaric, and Moses with horns, Jews as demonic. The whole story of Moses with horns is worthy of a separate, complete unit. I'm not going to get into it here. Many of you have seen much on this, so I won't repeat it. But as people who are stuck under the old law, and one of the important parts of the old law is the idea of circumcision. And what's interesting is that in this group of people, Mary and her cousin Elizabeth here, and even her mother are, they look fairly kind of normal. And even the representatives of the Jews, Joseph here, and this old man who represents the high priest, they're not unsympathetically depicted, except that they're a little hunched and a little old. Everybody is a little old because it is the old dispensation. Something that I find fascinating about this painting, but nobody has remarked on yet, is the following: the image of the high priest here may be somewhat familiar to you in some way. Coincidence? Bum, bum, bum. In the North, however, there is less gentle kind of projection of Jews. I want to show you one painting. This is Roger Campan's Marriage of the Virgin. Here's the Virgin Mary. She's getting married to a much older Joseph here. It's a story that's not in the Gospels, but is in the apocryphal works around the Gospels. And this is the Temple in Jerusalem. Part of it is depicted like the Dome of the Rock. This is something I've discussed before. And it has in Romanesque style, and it has a new facade placed up against it, which is in the process of being built. What's interesting to me here are the images of all the Jews except for the Virgin Mary here and her mother Anna behind her. All the Jews here are depicted as sort of demonic caricatures. They sit at the edge of human kind of criminality and hideousness. Moreover, the scenes that are depicted in the temple, because Christians imagine the temple as a sort of cathedral, and if it was a cathedral, it had to have images in it. So what would the image be? Well, things from the Old Testament, because Jesus hadn't arrived yet, you see. So no Christ, no Mary, no saints. But stories, for instance, of Lot's wife being turned into a pillar of salt, which represents the Jews and their ossification. They are stony-hearted. Or the sacrifice of Isaac, showing Jewish bloodthirstiness and showing especially the servant with the donkey, who represents the Jews who are animalistic and stuck in materiality. Or the story of Adam and Eve and their expulsion from the garden. or the story of the parting of the ways of Lot and Abram, all about, or the story of Cain and Abel, all of which are interpreted in Christian thought as the good guy being the Christians and the bad guy being the Jews. So here, hidden in this image where all the Jews are present, right, are images that show the Jews themselves to be corrupt, terrible people. But look at the physiognomies of everybody. They're dark, they're sallow, they look foreign. Joseph is depicted as a bitter old man with a tightly shaved head. This was characteristic of criminals and miscreants. And if you look at all the Jews, including the high priest, who's unshaven and looks like a true, like, appointee to, incompetent appointee to some cabinet, just put in that position to own the libs, right? And Joseph here again, terrible face, right? This gossipy woman here, all the strange glances, the violent gestures. It reminds us of later art, such as this by a follower of Hieronymus Bosch, in which the only normal or even beautiful characters are Jesus himself and Veronica, who's the one who holds the cloth up to Jesus's face to relieve him. Everybody else is hideous and deformed and represents some aspect of the Jews or the Romans. For Christians, these two groups were allied very closely. And so, Joseph represents the old here, not the charming, old man who is Jesus's foster father, but this guy who represents what's gone by, what's criminal, what's ancient, what's sacrificial. And only the Virgin Mary here and her mom, who's looking at this gossipy woman shown in profile with an aquiline nose, as if to say, can you believe these Jews, right? Only she and she are depicted in any sense normally. Of course, Jews could be depicted as monstrous in art. And as you can see here, we have a good Christian knight surrounded by evil Jewish caricatures in a Latin manuscript. Except if you've been with me before, you will know that this is not a Latin manuscript, but a Hebrew manuscript. And that here, when Jews depict themselves, they depict the others around them, people who are ethnically non-Jews, in a monstrous sense. So just as this kind of monstrousness invective was flung at Jews, Jews were good at flinging it back at everybody in the world who wasn't them, Africans and Celts and Arabs and Germans and Saxons and Arabs and Celts. In a sense, right, Maurice Sendak's Where the Wild Things Are is a continuation of this tradition, but in a much more charming key. And so, Christians could demonize and animalize their enemies, but Jews could do it as well. It's taking a page from the Christian playbook. And as you know from my previous talks with you, there were all kinds of ways of distorting faces in Jewish art, some of which look quite monstrous, but they're not intended to be monstrous in the way that the Christian caricatures are. While we're on this subject, it's been a while since we talked about anti-Semitism in Jewish art, so to speak. And I don't know if you know, but there's this theory that in my beloved Birds or Griffin's Head Haggadah, these big-nosed bird kind of creatures are anti-Semitic caricatures. Of that's the assumption. And looking at them, you would be I wouldn't blame you for thinking so. But the fact is that they represent something else, which is the lion-eagle hybrid called the griffin. And that represents the cherubs on the Ark of the Covenant and the griffin-like sphinxes in the temple in Jerusalem, and is a positive thing. So the idea that that these kinds of images are anti-Jewish images because you're reading them back through Nazi caricature is not a very good idea to espouse. This is something I've spoken about before, but if people need a refresher, I'll talk about it again one day. Now, this is art, so who cares, right? It's just art. Just people are just saying stuff. Well, as we will soon find out in our own polity, it's not just people saying stuff. There will be very real consequences of rhetoric, as there are very real consequences of art. Jews were expelled largely due to public popular sentiment among the people who saw images like we saw. And Jews were tortured and often burnt alive in a number of occasions in the Middle Ages. In fact, going back to that Welt Chronik of 1493, I said 1491, the very first illustrated book ever printed in Europe has two illustrations of Jewish miscreancy and its consequences. One, the blood libel, which we saw, and the other, this image of Jews being burnt alive at Nuremberg. Well, what hope is there? It's kind of dark, right? This idea of the demonization of the Jewish image. But I want to show you something that's really a wonderful image. I rediscovered this the other day. I went to the Siena exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. If you can get to it, I would highly advise it. And this depicts an episode in St. Luke's Gospel about the finding of Jesus in the temple. To make a long story short, Mary and Joseph and Jesus go up for Pesach to the Beis Hamikdash, as one does. And Jesus gets lost in the crowd, and they find him in the Beis Hamikdash debating various, presumably theological matters with the teachers, right? The priests, the proto-rabbis, whoever was there. And when his parents chide him, he says, well, I had to be in my father's house. It's as simple as that, right? I had a cheshek, I had a desire to be in my father's house, right? Very important story, et cetera, et cetera. But look at this image. Mary sitting down on the ground, because why should she sit in the chair? I'll sit here, it's fine. Don't worry about me. I'll be fine, right? She's holding up her hand like, what? What's with you? Joseph saying, look at your mother, you're torturing her. And little Jesus, for the first and only time in Renaissance art, is standing there with his hands crossed, looking cross and pouting. This is possibly the most accurate depiction of a bar mitzvah boy, because Jesus was 12, in all of world art. And I bring it to you here as an example because this is really, it's about the Holy Family, but somewhere in their heart of hearts, and sometimes quite explicitly, Christians understood that the Holy Family was a Jewish family. And the utter normativity of this depiction is, I think, a very, very beautiful and very telling one. And the other, of course, is that there are any number, and this is where my logo comes from, you see? There are a small number, I should say, not any number, a small number of depictions in which Jews are depicted on the same level as equals, so to speak, with the Christians among them. Here, a Jewish poet named Troubadour, called Suskin, the Jew of Trimborg, as it is labeled up here, is in discourse with the local bishop. And you can see that the Jew is standing, the bishop's on his throne. They're both wearing ermine cloaks, but the Jew's cloak is even more expensive because it's blue than the bishop's cloak. And they're having a natural conversation with perhaps interpreters between them. So my wish and my blessing for all of us is that in spite of this negative imagery, that we be able to move forward and get into as many positive conversations as we possibly can. And you know where to reach me. And it is now time for questions. So I will stop the share, although not the steal, apparently. Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, you're very welcome,
It's so funny that you brought up the synagogue and ecclesia after our trip where we saw it. We had to force our guide to take us to see it as we walked by the cathedral in Worms because we knew it was there. And she said, we're going to be late. We can't see it. But I was with Rabbi Spitz and he made her take, it was very close. So we went around and we saw it. And what was interesting is that I assume, because we saw it there, that all those images are really by the front door as you walk into the church, the cathedral. So I guess one of the questions I saw was the art you showed us, the negative art.
right.
Where was it? I mean, situated. Some of it is on buildings, and some of
Yes.
it are in books, but they didn't really read books back then. So who is looking at this art, I guess is the question.
So when you say they didn't really read books, very wealthy people commissioned books, they read books, they saw them. So the
But that's
anti-Jewish movement,
it's a minority. I'm saying, where did
yes,
the
but
majority see this?
if you'll excuse me, if you'll excuse me, Eric,
You're excused.
okay. There is no, you're supposed to say there is no excuse for you, Mark. Okay. No, the people who were reading those books were the elites, were the policymakers, right? So it wasn't the shit kickers who, who made the decisions to expel Jews or to persecute Jews. It was Dafka, the very people, church people and state people who were reading those books. However, the cathedral was the book of the unlearned. And so these things are situated right on the interstitial, liminal parts of the cathedral. This is a very good observation, Ari. You should be an art historian. I've told you this often, but you don't listen to me. You persist in supposedly being a lawyer. But they're right on the interstices, on the liminal place, right, between two worlds. So these images could be seen by Jews as an admonition to them, and as Christians as an exhortation to how to be a good Christian and what to think about the Jews. The other thing, and this is fascinating, is stained glass windows. Stained glass windows can be seen from outside the church when the church is lit from within. And so they formed a sort of billboard. Now, I ask you, where do you think the Jews lived in the Middle Ages when these things were being created? You might think that they lived in a ghetto in the darkest, poorest part of town. They did not. In the Middle Ages, there were no ghettos. There were Jewish neighborhoods. There were some restrictions on Jewish movement, but not that many. It was only with the rise of the Venice ghetto in 1504 that Jews were officially confined at night to ghettos. Jews lived in neighborhoods, cheek by jowl with their Christian neighbors. And for the most part, those neighborhoods were on the cathedral or high streets, directly in the shadow of the cathedral. And Jews often did business, money lending and other things, on the steps of the cathedral itself. So while you were doing business with a Jew, you could look up and see what you were to think about the Jews in stone or glass. And as a Jew doing business, you could know that you were being scrutinized both by your Christian client and by the stony gaze of the statues above you. Hope that answers the question.
Terrific. A side question, since I was just in Frankfurt, and there's a note in the Judengasse Museum saying that that was actually the first ghetto because it predates Venice from the 1400s. But it is near the cathedral, by the way. But
So,
a side point.
right, depends on how you define ghetto. The Venice ghetto had gates that locked at night. It had guards. The Frankfurt ghetto was just an area that Jews were restricted to living in an area, but they could have free access.
It did have gates. It did have a guard, had a lock, and you couldn't go out on Shabbat. You couldn't go out on Christian holidays. Anyway, side discussion.
Is that
So
true? Is
yeah,
that true? I
yeah.
never heard of that.
So going back to you talked about
Clearly, I'm an ignoramus.
clearly you should have
Maybe I
joined
should
us
just
on
give
our
up.
trip to
Maybe I should just
Ashkenaz.
give up now. Maybe, you know what,
No, I just
Ari,
asked
Ari,
questions.
I'm sorry. It's just too much for me. It's breaking my heart. I am going to give you back the $15,000 that you got from Rochelle to pay me for this because obviously I am an incompetent scholar.
It's
I
just a
don't know.
question mark.
I
I am
think I'm
just
gonna.
walking in the
No,
streets of
I'm gonna have to.
Ashkenaz.
I'm gonna take the LSAT now because
I'm
I
thinking
work.
about our excellent trip to Spain with Marc Michael Epstein, comparing,
Okay, give
contrasting
me the
what I
next
learned.
question, man. Let's have the next question. I did
So
not know that. I
very,
didn't.
yeah. I actually corrected my guide and I said, no, this isn't the first ghetto. Marc Michael Epstein told me.
Maybe
He's
the
like, oh
Germans,
no,
maybe the
oh
Germans just made
no.
that up. Maybe they
Yeah.
made that up.
You
We can
check
fact,
into that for our
we
next program.
we'll fact check. Yeah.
So, right, I was fact checking my guide on the ground. The the story you tell about the Greco-Roman world and tying the Jews into plagues, and that's so interesting. So, do you think that's what carried through in the Christian world about connecting the Jews to plagues?
Well, I don't really have that much to say about this, but my wife Agi, Rabbanit Professor Agnes Veto, who you've never invited to speak at for CSP, has an entire thesis about this. And I think if I can, I don't want to say something in her name. She teaches a class called From Anti-Judaism to Anti-Semitism about how that came along. And I think that there is actually a seed of that that goes back to Hecataeus or some of the or Manetheo. She knows all these things. I know nothing about it, but it's a good guess, I would say.
And then I saw someone else ask, because you brought it up, the connection between the Jews, the matzah, and blood. Does that tie into the Christians, the Eucharist, and the blood? And that
Sounds
they're
like a
kind of
Jeff.
playing with that.
Yes, it sounds like a Jeff question actually, but it probably isn't Jeff. So I have a whole chapter in my book called The Medieval Haggadah about this. And basically, to summarize, at the time after 1215, and I don't mean like 1215 in the afternoon, I mean the year 1215, once it became de rigueur, necessary, tenet of the faith. My students always say tenant, like, a tenant is somebody who pays rent, right? Tenet, tenere, to hold, something that you had to hold. A tenant is also somebody who's held in the thrall of a landlord, but it's a different Latin construction. One of the tenets of the faith that you had to hold as a Catholic is that this Eucharistic host was the body and blood of Jesus. There was a problem because a lot of Christians just didn't believe that, right? So Christians went to great lengths theologically to prove that Jews also believe this. And if even a disbelieving Jew could believe that, right, then of course a Christian had to believe it. So how do we prove that Jews believe that Jesus is present in the host? Well, look what they do. When they bake matzah for their Seder, they need to create a demonic simulacrum. You like that? I'll do that again. 1 second. A demonic simulacrum, right? Which means a demonic imitation of the host. So what do? They have to take a little Christian baby and kill him and squeeze his blood into the matzah. And then the matzah can work just like the Eucharist works, because the Jews can't get the Eucharist, right? And they're jealous, right? They make these blood matzahs, right?
So is this,
Now,
wait, but is this a Marc Michael Epstein analysis, or is this a agreed upon analysis? Because
no,
at least it explains to me. I could never understand
a matzah is a fake host. A matzah is a magical host for Christians, right? And that's why it needs to have blood to operate. So I've written that. Everybody ignored it. Nobody, it's like you, Ari, like just discounting my
No, so
scholarship.
this is, I'm asking, is this your scholarship or is this generally
Yes,
accepted
yes,
scholarship?
yes, yes. It's
It's
in
just you. Okay.
me, the voice.
No, I mean, you've explained something. I was sitting around in Germany trying to figure out
Okay?
all these things.
The
What about
voice,
poisoning of the
and
wells? You didn't show
the
us any
voice.
images of poisoning of the wells.
That's it. That's one of the many, many. Right? I told you I can only show you a few. You want me to do 2 hours? You'll have to pay me $30,000, and Rochelle has to come up with the money. So the poisoning of the wells is something that Agi talks about in her class, right? It comes from, I think, quite correctly, this ancient canard about Jews and disease. Yes.
Okay. Well, so much fun. We could talk for another hour and we don't
And
have
you
it
could
because I have
continue.
another program
Oh,
coming up. I got to
yeah.
prepare for that one. Naomi Levy is coming. But can you give us a promo as to
Yeah.
what
So
art next week?
first of all, Ari, I love you. I really love joking with you. I can't talk like that to anybody in my real life. I'm very curious about this Frankfurt thing. It probably is true. Um, um, the it's just I'm so rarely wrong. It's pogea me. It bothers me. Next week we'll be talking about the Jewish Jesus in art. Right. So if we wanted to talk about Jesus in art, we could talk from now till Jesus shows up again, right? But the Jewish Jesus in art is something that's often neglected, and we will discuss that as we proceed next week. Not next week, December 2nd. Is that it?
December 5th.
December 5th. So it's Thursday, December 5th. Same place, but Thursday, December 5th.
And I put in the note there from the Judengasse Museum. Europe's first Jewish ghetto was located in Frankfurt, created in 1460.
They're
You're gonna
very
have
proud.
you're going to have to get
They're very
you're gonna
proud of it, the Germans.
right. I know they
Right.
want to claim it.
We had it first. It's like the Mel Brooks. Well, everybody should go listen to the Mel Brooks's the plantation. You can put it in your follow up, Ari. Mel Brooks, 2,000-year-old man, the last one with the Peruvian Indians. Find that
Oh,
one.
can you send that to me?
Yeah, I'll send it to you.
Oh, can you send me the link in the video from the first session? It was the animated like reproduction of the temple. I couldn't find, there was a movie or something that you shared part of it. We couldn't see it very well because it was kind of broken, but you shared
Yeah,
the
I'll
video.
try to find it. I'm not sure. I'm
Okay,
not
well, you're getting paid for this series, so you can find it for us, give us
$30,000, Rochelle. Get on
make
that.
this work. Okay. Everybody, I hope you've enjoyed
Love you
learning
all.
about art history with Marc Michael Epstein, the golem of Poughkeepsie.
Oh, Poughkeepsie.
Looking
All
forward to
right.
seeing you in December. Happy Thanksgiving to
Thank
you
you.
and your
You too.
family. Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach. As my grandmother used to say, why would I eat turkey on Thursday when I eat chicken on Friday? Okay. Peace. See you all. Nice
See you
to see
guys
you.
soon with Naomi Levy. Bye-bye, everybody. And